Imagine if you're having one last conversation with the people that you love the most. Your words are forever going to be your last words. And my guess is that you wouldn't talk about your favorite Netflix show or the latest Drake album. But if you're like me, you have no clue what you'd actually say in that moment, but you'd want to make sure that they were important words. You'd want to make your words matter. For the next few weeks, we're going to look at some of the most famous last words ever recorded. And since we're in church, it probably comes as no surprise to you that these words come from Jesus. During his time on earth, Jesus obviously said a lot of things worth writing down, but some of his most profound statements actually happened right before he died. And they were written down and recorded by four guys named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the fact they were written down is a good thing, because we all have a tendency to forget, right? And we forget where we put our phone, our retainer, the TV remote, but our tendency to forget things impacts more than just that. For those of you who have a relationship with God and consider yourself Jesus followers, our tendency to forget can play into that too. In fact, forgetfulness can sometimes be one of the biggest barriers to us having a healthy relationship with God. Now that may sound strange, but think about it. Don't we all have a hard time remembering all the good things God has done for us, given us, and allowed us to be a part of, especially when things go bad in life? We're like, God, do you even care about me? Why won't you do something about this terrible situation? We forget all the good things he's done. And we tend to blame God for the difficult circumstances we're in right now while forgetting all those wonderful things he did just before that. But here's a question. When things go wrong, how can we make sure our attention and focus isn't consumed by the bad things in life? The key to conquering this battle is to remember. The answer is as simple as one word, one action item. Remember. Got it. Or do you? You may be thinking, remember? Remember what? Let me give you a quick refresher. On one particular evening, Jesus and his disciples were sharing an important meal. It was the Passover meal. The disciples didn't know this was going to be Jesus' final meal with them, but Jesus did. And knowing this, Jesus shared some important things with the people that he was closest to. Before we get to exactly what Jesus said, which we'll look at in the coming weeks, we need to cover a little background to see exactly what this dinner party was all about. Hundreds of years before Jesus arrived on earth, God miraculously saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. You see, the Egyptian Pharaoh had been using the Jewish people as slaves, and since that meant he got to build his kingdom out of free labor, he wasn't exactly planning on letting them go anytime soon. So God sent a messenger named Moses to request that the slaves be released. Then every time Pharaoh said no, God sent a new plague to drive him crazy and speed up the process. There was a wave of dead fish, then a wave of frogs, and later a wave of bugs, and so forth. The story's wild. And over again, God sent a wave of something difficult to get Pharaoh's attention and remind him why he should release the slaves. Now, the last plague was really awful, though. The firstborn male child of every family died. It's morbid, I know. For the Jewish families enslaved, however, there was a way out. Now, this sounds crazy, but hang with me for a second. They were told to place some lamb's blood on their doors as a sign that they were the Jewish people. Then the night of the last plague, God would pass over the firstborn males in those homes and allow them to live. To make a very long story short, the Jewish people obeyed the instructions. Their children were saved from the last plague, and the plague caused so much pain in Egypt that Pharaoh finally allowed them to leave. It was the end of slavery and a new beginning for the Jewish people. And from that moment on, Jewish people had a tradition of remembering the Passover. They celebrated how God rescued their ancestors with the Passover meal. Year after year, they'd gather around a table, much like we do Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they'd retell the story of how they were once slaves, but God rescued them. And just like many of our holiday traditions include food, so do theirs. Part of the meal involved eating unleavened bread and drinking wine. Now, I know this sounds like a boring history lesson, but bear with me for just one more minute as I quickly explain. Unleavened bread was made without yeast, which represented how quickly the Israelites left Egypt. There was no time to wait for the bread to rise. The wine represented the blood of the lambs that were sacrificed to save the Jews. Got it? Okay, good. Now this brings us back to the table where Jesus is celebrating. Remember, Jesus was Jewish. He grew up celebrating, remembering, and retelling the story of the Passover along with his family. And now he was doing the same thing with his disciples. They probably all knew how the dinner was supposed to go, how the story was supposed to be told. But then Jesus does something new. He took some bread, gave thanks to God for it, Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This is the cup of the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." Jesus said the bread and the wine now represented his body and his blood. In other words, he was saying this: these symbols now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you and die for you. Every time you eat this bread and drink this wine, I want you to do something really important. I want you to remember me. Remember me. Remember my sacrifice for you. Remember my great love for you. It's pretty cool, right? So why is this so important to regularly remember what Jesus did and who he is? Because Jesus knew that life would be difficult and painful, not just for the disciples, but for everyone, including us. Jesus knew that in moments when life goes bad and things get off track, we'll have the tendency to focus on the bad and forget the good. We'll wonder where God is and why he isn't doing anything about our circumstances. And we'll forget that Jesus died for us and he demonstrated his great and unfailing love. Jesus knows we have a tendency to forget, and that's why in his famous last words, he gave his disciples a way to remember. Simply put, Jesus said this: remember what God has done for you. So the question is this: how? How do we remember? Let's start with two ways. Remember ways in which God has been good to you in the past. See, the Jewish people observed the Passover meal to remind themselves of God's love, protection, and faithfulness. In the same way, it's important that you and I remember those times when God showed up too, when he was faithful, when he helped us through a tough season in life. Maybe create a praise journal and document good things that happened to you and make the connection between the good thing and God. Like you passed a test that you thought you would fail. God did that. Write it down. You were uncertain about your new haircut and someone complimented you. Write it down. God just lifted your spirit. You met a new friend that you trust and makes you better. Write it down. God just gave you a gift. You have had a rocky relationship with your parents lately, but things are showing signs of improvement. You can't write that down quick enough. God is repairing things in your home. You got baptized. You started serving. A friend you invited to church chose to follow Jesus. Write those things down so you can look back on them and remember the good things God has done in your life, especially when God seems distant or your life is riddled with problems. Number two, we need to revisit this list and add to it. It's one thing to remember God's goodness, but we need to keep going back again and again to those memories. Also, pay attention to when God shows up and does something on our behalf now and add it to the list. Like we said, over time we tend to forget things, and the Jewish people recognized that, which is why they celebrated the Passover, because they wanted to celebrate the goodness of God even when times are difficult. So instead of just relying on yourself to remember, take time to document those good things and revisit it regularly. Remembering is what allows us to trust God even when we can't see what he's up to. And when we don't see what he's up to, we don't have to worry about it as long as we remember what he came down to do.